Stakeholder theory. A question asked before the strategy gets written about who the firm is for. 1984. Edward Freeman publishes Strategic Management, a stakeholder approach, and reframes the question at the centre of corporate purpose. Before Freeman, the mainstream answer had been 14 years old and written by Milton Friedman in the New York Times Magazine. The business of business is business. The firm exists to maximise return for its owners within the law, and the rest is distraction. Freeman did not abolish the shareholder. He relocated the shareholder. One group among several with a legitimate claim on the firm's conduct. Freeman's definition is the line most often quoted and most often misread. A stakeholder is any group or individual who can affect, or is affected by, the achievement of the organisation's objectives. Affect or be affected. That is a wider circle than the firm's own chart of obligations. It pulls in employees, customers, suppliers, capital providers, regulators, communities, and, as later scholarship made explicit, the natural environment and future generations too. Donaldson and Preston, writing in 1995, made the distinction that still matters. Stakeholder theory is three theories in one. Descriptive, a claim about who the firm actually has relationships with. Instrumental, a claim that firms which take those relationships seriously produce better returns. Normative, a claim that those relationships carry moral weight whether or not they are useful. Most boards, when they adopt the language, mean the instrumental version. Freeman's theory at its foundation is normative. Here is the argument the rest of this note will make. The theory is easy to endorse and hard to apply. Any boardroom will say it considers its stakeholders. The test of the theory is what happens when stakeholders pull in opposite directions and the board has to choose. In those moments, the theory does not tell you who wins. It tells you that you cannot define the losers out of the room, and it offers a test, which I will name in a moment, for whether what you did is still inside the theory or has quietly become Friedman's answer in Freeman's language. First, the case the theory is being tested against. February 2020. Bernard Looney, newly appointed Chief Executive of BP, stood up in London and announced the net zero ambition for 2050. The detailed targets followed at the September 2020 Strategy Day, including the now famous commitment to cut oil and gas production by 40% by 2030, and the capital tilt towards renewables, hydrogen, and electric charging. Looney was, in Freeman's language, redrawing the stakeholder coalition. BP would now explicitly serve climate-vulnerable communities, the energy transition workforce, and the long-horizon investor. Fossil fuel retail holders and short-cycle hedge funds would need to accept a different company. September 2023. Looney left, not over this strategy, but over undisclosed relationships at work. Murray Auchincloss, his chief financial officer, stepped up. For a year, the net zero pledge held on paper. Strategies rarely snap on the day a new chief executive arrives. They drift. The board's internal consensus takes months to rewrite itself, and capital commitments already in flight do not stop on instruction. The 12-month interval between Looney's departure and the reset was not indecision. It was institutional inertia, which is the form most strategic change actually takes. February 2025. Auchincloss announced what BP called a fundamental reset. Capital expenditure on oil and gas raised to $10 billion a year. Renewables spend cut. The 40% oil cut target had already been moderated to 25% in February 2023 under Looney. Auchincloss's reset withdrew the production cut target altogether. The company that had tried hardest in its sector to be a stakeholder theory company had reversed itself. Who pulled which way? The activist pressure on BP did not start with Elliott. In January 2024, Bluebell Capital Partners had written publicly to Chair Helge Lund, demanding the same shift Elliott would later force, that BP halt the transition, cut renewables spend, and return more capital to shareholders. Elliott was the heavier hand on a campaign Bluebell had begun. Elliott Management, the activist fund, took a stake of around 5% in the weeks before the reset and became public in pushing for further divestment of renewables. The 5% stake mattered because of what came with it: a credible threat of escalation, a reputation for winning campaigns, and the urgency of a fund that does not hold for a decade. Legal and General Investment Management and Nest, the UK's workplace pension, publicly opposed the reset on the grounds that it reduced long-run value. Follow this, a campaigning shareholder filed resolutions. BP's own workforce of around 100,000 pulled in different directions. The refiners in Gelsenkirchen wanting the oil strategy, the renewables teams in Iberia, and the North Sea not. The UK government sat bound by a 2050 net zero legal obligation and a balance of payments concern. Communities at Whiting and Castellon watched different parts of the decision. Freeman's lens on what Auchincloss did is more contested than the boardroom version allows. The generous reading is re-weighting. He did not escape his stakeholders. He chose a different coalition. Elliott, near-term oil-exposed holders, certain supplier communities, up-weighted. Climate-aligned investors, the transition workforce, and the NGO circle, down-weighted. A board cannot define stakeholders out of existence. They remain in the room and they act. There is a stronger reading of the reset than the generous one, and the note has to address it. Michael Jensen's argument, from the 1970s onwards, was that a firm's purpose is shareholder value, and that any pledge destroying shareholder value, however ethically motivated, has misread the firm's role. By Jensen's logic, Looney's 2020 pledge was a normative overreach disconnected from BP's instrumental capabilities and capital structure, and Auchincloss is rescuing the firm from a strategy that destroyed shareholder value without satisfying the climate constituency. On that reading, the reset is not an ethical failure, it is a market correction. The note does not accept this reading as final, but the note has to acknowledge it because it is the Steelman case Auchincloss's board would deploy if pressed. What the next paragraph asks is not whether Jensen's reading is internally coherent. It is. The next paragraph asks whether a board that adopts that reading is still practicing stakeholder theory at all, or whether it has, in adopting Jensen's answer, also adopted Freeman's, and is now operating outside Freeman's framework, whatever language the press release uses. The harder reading is that reweighting a stakeholder's claim to near zero is not stakeholder theory at all. It is Friedman's answer in Freeman's language. And here is the test, the original analytical move this note proposes for telling the difference. Call it the ethical residue test. After reweighting, can the board articulate, in plain language, the ethical claim of the stakeholder it has downgraded, in terms the stakeholder itself would recognize? If it can, it has stayed inside Freeman's theory. The displaced group has been heard, weighed, and explicitly addressed. If it cannot, it has left the theory. It is no longer practicing stakeholder theory. It is managing the public relations costs of shareholder primacy. The test is harder than it sounds, because it requires the board to articulate the Steelman case for the position it just rejected. Most boards in most reset moments do not do this work. They issue a statement that thanks the displaced group for their input and moves on. A note on what recognize means in this test, because the wording will be tested in any boardroom that adopts it. Recognize does not mean agree. A climate-aligned investor whose claim has been downgraded will rarely agree with the downgrading. Recognize means comprehend the ethical reasoning as a logically sound moral argument, even while contesting it. The test is borrowed in spirit from procedural justice scholarship. A stakeholder can lose in a process they recognize as fair and remain in the coalition. The same stakeholder, losing in a process they cannot recognize, leaves the coalition and becomes an external force. Where BP sits on that test in 2026 is, on the public record, an open question. The reset announcement did not articulate the ethical claim of the climate-aligned investor in terms that investor would comprehend as a logically sound moral argument. It articulated instead the financial logic of a company under activist pressure. By the ethical residue test, BP exited Freeman's theory in February 2025. By the more generous reweighting reading, BP changed its coalition, and the displaced groups remain in the room as a future force the company will have to address again. The positive contrast that makes the theory legible. Ørsted AS. Until 2017, Ørsted was Dong Energy, the Danish state-controlled utility that held the unflattering distinction of being the most coal-intensive electricity producer in Europe. Henrik Poulsen took over as chief executive in 2012 and led the company until 2020. The decisive pivot was sequenced across his tenure, with the upstream oil and gas divestment closing in 2017 and the renamed Ørsted following in October of that year. The board, with the Danish state as majority owner, had a Freeman-style choice: keep the existing stakeholder coalition that had built the company, the coal workforce, the fossil fuel suppliers, the short-cycle bondholders, or pivot to a different coalition. Poulsen pivoted. The company that had been Europe's dirtiest utility became, within 5 years, the largest offshore wind developer in the world. Critically, Poulsen's board did the work the BP board did not. They articulated on the record the ethical claim of every displaced stakeholder. The coal workforce was offered transition agreements, retraining and pension protection. The fossil supplier ecosystem was given exit windows long enough to retool. The short-cycle bondholders, who would have preferred the old company, were addressed in financial communications that said, in terms, that this company was no longer for them. The Ørsted pivot was ferocious in execution and surgical in stakeholder communication. The execution since has been bumpier than the strategy. Ørsted retained certain coal plants longer than originally planned because the 2022 European energy crisis forced regulators to keep them running. Its US offshore wind portfolio took heavy write-downs in 2023 and 2024 as interest rates repriced the entire sector. The point of the contrast for our purposes is not the share price or the macro execution. It is the stakeholder communication discipline. Ørsted and BP started in similar places, with similar stakeholder pressures, and the theory produced opposite outcomes, because the work the theory demands was done in one boardroom and not in the other. The critique that Freeman's theorists have to answer. Michael Jensen, writing in 2001, argued that stakeholder theory leaves directors with no compass. Every claim is a pull. Accountability dissolves because no single metric governs. Freeman's response is older than the critique. Accountability to a single metric is only a compass if you have already accepted a prior ethical choice about whose interest that metric encodes. The prior choice is the theory, not its absence, to which Jensen's response was that the prior choice is hidden inside Freeman's theory rather than confronted. The argument has not concluded. It will not. It is the live argument inside every boardroom that sets a long-term strategy. As of April 2026, we do not know whether the BP reset holds. Helge Lund, the chair who backed both Looney's pledge and Auchincloss's reversal, announced his departure in April 2025. A new chair may shift the coalition. Elliott may push further. The stakeholders that were down-weighted in the reset, the pension funds, the campaigners, the transition workforce, have not gone away. They are still in the room. Freeman would say they were always going to be. The ethical residue test will return to BP in some form, in some moment, regardless of whether the current board chooses to apply it. 3 things to carry forward. A reading. Freeman's Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach, 1984, is still the anchor text. Pair it with Donaldson and Preston, The Stakeholder Theory of the Corporation, in the Academy of Management Review, 1995, the best short account of how the theory is actually 3 theories. And for the counterpole, Friedman's 1970 essay read in full. For the positive contrast, Henrik Poulsen's published interviews from 2020 and 2021, available through Wood Mackenzie's archive and the Harvard Business Review, give the cleanest first-person account of how a board does the work the theory demands. A question. If you asked your board today to name the 5 stakeholders whose claims are being downgraded by the current strategy, could they name them? And could they articulate the ethical justification for downgrading each, in terms the stakeholder itself would recognize? If the answer to the second part of the question is no, your board has left Freeman's theory whether it knows it or not. And the wider library. Freeman gives you a map of who is in the room. Mendelow tells you how much power each holds and how engaged they are. Agency and stewardship theory tell you whose behavior the board structure is trying to shape. Each tool answers a different question about the same set of claims. Pessel, in the previous note, tells you what is changing in the macro environment that will adjust the claims themselves. Curated by Matthew Doyle. Made partners,